settlers found that the Pequot Indians called this river something that sounded to their New England ears a lot like the word mystic. But when that little two-syllable noise was translated, it turned out to be not about religion, but the tides. Mystic in Pequot seemed to mean great tidal river. The word great was a bit of a joke, as the water in question ran barely a half-dozen miles from the land under Lantern Hill to that part of Long Island Sound we now call Fisher's Island Sound. It turns out, however, that the great part is not so much in the river's length as in its usefulness. The fact that it is a tidal river, or what we call today an estuary, after the Greek, means it provides the perfect mix of salt and fresh water, in which shellfish, especially oysters, thrive. It is the rhythm of the tides that growers seek to emulate. Dr. Sun Feng delighted in talking about the way shellfish he'd placed in tanks continued to respond to the same tidal rhythms that were taking place out here in the estuary. And while scientists can certainly parse the salinity and other factors, there yet remains a kind of mystical element in the miracle of this succulent food we call the oyster. Few people today realize that the oyster industry was once the primary fishery in the United States, and oysters the most eaten of all shellfish. At the turn into the 20th century, the oyster industry in New England maintained a huge fleet of boats and employed thousands of workers. In the 1890s, oysters were eaten as a snack food. They were as popular as hot dogs are today. At that time, Connecticut not only had the largest fleet of oyster steamboats in the world, but to keep the industry growing, producers developed the leading seed oyster business in New England. The original shellfish beds of the Chesapeake Bay and Long Island Sound were so extensive they were thought to be inexhaustible. But after World War I, the shellfish industry started a slow decline, and by the 1950s, it had all but vanished. Today we're going to look at the oystering industry, which has been around for generations and generations. I've got a bunch of old tools and baskets right around here, and we're going to look at the boats that these tools were used on, meet some of the people who still continue in this noble old industry, and go down to the hatchery in Noank where they're doing some new stuff in the business. Some of this oyster gear goes back over 100 years. Some is the latest thing. You find them all mixed together. It's as if you went into a modern state-of-the-art office building and found a guy with a quill pen working next to a computer. Let's see if we can sort some of this out. What's old, what's new, and how we get from one thing to another, and why. After all, oysters haven't changed that much, but the conditions under which they live have. Now, when the settlers first started going after the shellfish in this area, they used some fairly simple sort of backyard tools. Here's a rake that almost looks like you'd use it on your leaves or in your garden. But one of the differences is these little butterfly nuts here, which allow you to adjust the tines depending upon what you're looking for and what the limit size is as you're scratching down there in the mud. Over here you see you have one that has the basket right in it, so that as you scuff up the bottom there, your catch will end up in the basket. Here's another one over there that looks almost like a garden tool, but it's basically for getting down in the water for clams, probably more than oysters. Then we start getting into deeper water as we consume the shellfish that are in close to shore. You're wading out here up to your knees in these first three tools I showed you. Now you're in much deeper water. All right, we're going out the By Channel here, which was dug by a guy named McLeary in about 1906. It hasn't been really redug since. Here's Annie, built in 1883, rebuilt 2 years ago. She's still working. You think of what went on in 1883, building the George Washington Bridge, Washington Monument, Huckleberry Finn. Okay, we're out here in the Mystic River, about the middle of the river in terms of up and down, and in the middle of the river in terms of back and forth. We're aboard Annie, built in 1883 in Smithtown, New York, which is on the north side of Long Island.
Tornado Bridge, got a train going over in a couple minutes. As soon as he's clear, I'll open the bridge for you.
My father, he started in the business, I would say around 1916, 17, along in there. This vessel, the Annie, spelt A-N-N-E, was built in Smithtown, New York in 1884. So she's getting to be long in years. I can remember the boat. I was maybe 4 years old. We lived in Greenport. And I remember my father taking me down to the shipyard. He had this boat hauled out, and he was having a round stern put on her. She was built as a sloop, had the square stern, and she was approximately 40 foot long in those days. We came from Greenport, moved to New London in 1928, and started the business in the Thames River, and at that time, in those days, we had ground over in Gardiner's Bay, and we'd run from New London to Gardiner's Bay probably 3 times a week. In 1934, we had an oyster shop in New London, across from the railroad station, and that lasted until the 1938 hurricane. We wound up with just the concrete floor. The building, that was scattered all over. Well, during the war, we carried building materials out to the forts when the forts were starting to build up. Sand, gravel, bathtubs, windows, whatever. Any type of building material. We've done that for a few years. Grey Gull, and also Fort Wright, Fisher's Island. We worked on the lighthouse. That was, I believe, in 1954. We done that job. This is the oyster dredge, and it goes along the bottom. Okay, these teeth which you see here go down in the mud and dig up your oysters. The level at which this is rigged, of course, controls how deep. You don't want to go down and anchor or dig too deep, because then you will end up anchoring by this. And of course, you don't want to be just bouncing across the top. So that level of adjustment is part of the skill of the operator, who's up there behind me in the wheelhouse. And he will direct the guy on deck how much chain to put out, and this is also a function of how fast he's driving the boat. When my dad was out here, he worked altogether different than we do today. This boat had the dredges come in over the side on rollers, fore and aft roller and up and down roller. We didn't have this high mast and the boom and hydraulics and all that. Everything was more or less hand work, although we did have the heisters. And everything was hand-picked. As the dredge come up, you dumped it on deck, and you got down on your hands and knees, and you hand-picked it from the deck. You really need a table for what we're doing right now, sorting the oysters from the shells. If you were working to throw a load on, you wouldn't need the table. This boat we used to load right to the wheelhouse windows. From the windows, from the wheelhouse right to the post. You carry 750 bushel, and I've seen a good many loads of that amount on them. You've got to, it's like farming, you've got to harrow the ground. You're going to have to depend on nature more than anything. You do your work, you get the stuff down here, and if nature feels that you should make a living, maybe you would. The interesting thing to me about this vessel
is while there have been a few changes in the technology, this vessel operates pretty much the way that it did in 1883. That is to say, it puts oysters out, it puts shell out, and it gets oysters and shell back. And while traditional bottom farming would still best be done by this type of boat in this fashion, the days of raising oysters by just spreading them over the bottom are pretty much over. Round bottom boats like Annie, which go back to the late 19th century, did make a comeback in the 1980s, but now they have become, once again, museum pieces. They've been replaced by small, even shallower craft, which are little more than speedy platforms which handle cages. If you go back far enough, of course, you didn't need the Annie or even the rakes. You could just stroll along a sandbar at low tide in your bare feet with your basket under your arm. But even here, in this seemingly idyllic setting, we can see, looming in the background, the sort of shoreline industry that contributes to the change in the water. And so there are a number of problems that face the oyster business now: pollution, storms, disease, and predators. Traditionally, creatures such as the starfish and oyster drill have been the problem. In the 1950s, another threat emerged, a disease called MSX. Recently, there's been a boom in the green crab population, and what with a scarcity of disease-resistant oyster stock, it becomes crucial for oyster growers to protect what little they do have. These shaggy-looking boxes look like lobster pots. They're not. They're oyster cages. Captain Tom Yonke and his crew, Dan Badger, are working this gear on the very flats out here, where the fire barges of British Admiral Thomas Hardy ran aground in their unsuccessful attempt to burn Mystic in 1812.
I started out, I was a marine biologist working in Florida, and then I came up to Connecticut. I worked at Mystic Seaport Museum as a ship's carpenter for 17 years, but I became allergic to the dust over the course of that time. I was looking around for other work, and the only other thing I really know how to do is aquaculture, because I was involved with the original pilot project, doing shrimp culture. I met and got to know Larry Malloy, and we talked about grounds and who was doing what and things like that. And then I got a phone call from Larry, and he asked me if I was interested in buying Annie and taking over the leases, because he was going to be retiring from shellfishing. And so I worked with him for about 6 months, and liked what I saw, liked what I did, and ended up buying the boat, and the leases were transferred. 4 years ago, I bought a new boat, the Linny J, and transferred some of the work that was being done by Annie to the Linny J. We used cages because when the parasites came and cleaned everything out, I decided that in order to make it in this industry, you'd have to try everything that you could think of to make it work. The wild stocks were gone from the river. Also, I felt a need to get into cage culturing, so that, and I could do the cages in a different area. I could do cages in the Mystic River, where the bottom is basically too muddy to raise oysters. In cage culture, my intention was to buy hatchery stock. There are a couple hatcheries on Long Island Sound, and hatchery stock is relatively expensive compared to natural set, which is basically free. With hatchery stock, you can get them if you get them toward the end of the summer, they're about an inch in size, and so you've basically gained a whole year. They'll be spawned in February, March, sometime like that. But the young oysters from the hatcheries have not grown big enough to be resistant to the predators. Their shells have to get strong enough so that the green crabs and other crabs cannot simply crush them. But they'll take a 1-inch oyster and they'll smash it, just crush it between their jaws. And one of the other oystermen did put out a lot. After I was in cages, started doing work in cages, he just put some on the bottom. He was one of the hatchery guys. And he lost, was it 3 or 5 million oysters? I don't know, it doesn't matter how many he lost. He lost every one of them.
The person Tom was talking about, who lost his oysters almost overnight to the green crab, is Jim Marco. We find Jim downriver about a mile from the flats at the Noank Aquaculture Co-op.
And what happened was we planted the stuff on the bottom, and within a week we came back. We couldn't find an oyster. It was over 1 million oysters. So the green crabs came in and just ate everything. So the best thing that we found to do was we came down, put mass on, planted some seed, looked at what was going on, watched the green crabs come out, and just saw them eating the things at a rate that was unbelievable. 1 million oysters in a week was pretty hard to take, because it took us an awful long time and a lot of money to grow 1 million oysters. So within 1 week, all that effort was gone, and we had just crushed shells to show for it.
The theoretical solution to these threats was to grow the seed oysters in a hatchery. And when the animals grew large enough to be placed out in open waters, protect them with cages. The best location for the new technology was the eastern end of Long Island Sound, where the waters open out into the ocean. The hatcheries were also able to come up with a technique that through natural means accelerated the growth of the animals, and by doing so, cut down on the window of opportunity of the disease. The problem was that there was no place to work out this hatchery technique in Connecticut until a small group of people had a vision. Noank in the 19th century was known as a shipbuilding and lobstering community. However, commercial oystering had been done on the bottom of the harbor since the early 20th century. About the same time, there was a state hatchery for lobsters. The 1938 hurricane carried this wooden frame building away, but the state found another site a few hundred yards upriver in a brick thread mill that had withstood the storm. In 1998, the Groton Shellfish Commission found out that this site was going to be available. So they came up with a concept of having a commercial hatchery that would work with the town Shellfish Commission. The hatchery would produce shellfish not only for the commercial hatchery, but also for local shellfish commissions.
You and I came and toured this place with Jim Markow and asked him first, what would you do if you had this place under your control?
Right.
And then we started thinking about the shell fishermen that didn't have homes, that were getting displaced by marinas and so on. And then we brought it to the whole commission.
Yeah.
And they thought that it had a lot of potential. And from there, we threw that plan together.
The big thing and the big factor in the whole thing is we knew that there was no hatchery in the state of Connecticut. We had to buy our seeds from Long Island and the state of New York. So we felt, boy, if we could get something going here, and it would be great. And our state representative, she was very, very excited to know that we were going to set up a hatchery in Connecticut.
Approximately 3 years ago, the local Shellfish Commission gained knowledge that the University of Connecticut was going to abandon this facility. They put together an initial proposal, got together with my agency, we have with the lead agency in regards to shellfish farming in this state, and we went forward to seek state funding to do some remediation of this site and reconstruction of this ancient facility. And we are at this point in our final phases of reconstruction of this facility.
Karen Rivara was one of the founding members of the new co-op.
I got into shellfish farming through going to school for marine biology. When I was a little kid, I liked playing in the water, seeing what was growing in the water. I grew up on Lake Erie, which is a pretty big body of water, and liked to watch Jacques Cousteau on television. So I went to Southampton College and graduated with a degree in biology, and I majored in marine science. After that, I kind of puttered around for a couple years until I found a job working at the Shinnecock Tribe Oyster Project in Southampton as a research technician. I worked there for about 3 years until there was an opportunity to work for the Blue Points Company, and at that point I was so in love with shellfish farming that I decided I wanted to do that for a living, and it would be a good idea for me to work at a commercial company to learn the ropes, get my hands wet. Then decided I wanted to start saving money to to build my own hatchery and saved money to invest in the equipment to start a hatchery. My business partner, Jim Marco, and I set up a little hatchery in the basement of his house in Shirley, New York, and we could grow about 5 million oysters out of that hatchery. And so we did that for about 5 or 6 years. Jim originally worked at Blue Point's company. That's how we met each other, and he runs the harvest boats and does the grow out, gets the seed to market size, and I grow the shellfish seed in the hatchery. And what grew out of that was the concept of the cooperative. So basically what we've done is we've taken all of our individual assets, combined them together into a cooperative that's a vertically integrated company that benefits all of us.
Even though the technology has been around for many years, building a shellfish hatchery was a unique challenge.
The hatchery equipment, Stuart Madison, our hatchery manager, has worked over the off-season building a lot of the equipment. We've even built some of our algae tanks. So it's a lot of time and money, but part of the interest is that you get to tinker and come up with new ideas and build stuff. So it's a little bit of science, a little bit of carpentry, fiberglassing, welding. A lot of different disciplines go into running a shellfish facility.
We're building tanks like this so that when this algae in the other room has to get transferred, it can get transferred into here, and then we can continue to make more algae. This will be a mass culture tank. So it's kind of, we have to piecemeal it what we can afford at the time. We build it, we use it. Once we generate some money, we're able to upgrade, buy more materials, and continue on that way.
Looking at scientific progress that's occurred in the agricultural sector over the decades, now we're seeing the same progress in aqua farming or sea farming, and Connecticut's become a leader in that. This hatchery that we have here in Noank is really a fine example of the mix of science with traditional aqua farming or agricultural practices.
The hatchery process starts with growing algae.
The beginning phase of growing algae, you start in a stock culture room, and these are the primary cultures. Each of these flasks has a different species of algae in it. These algae are grown under sterile conditions so that only the species of algae that we've inoculated into this flask is growing. We don't want any bacteria growing in here. We don't want any other algae growing in here. We want to have a pure culture. Once we get our food to a point where we can use it to feed shellfish, we start conditioning our brood stock. So what we have to do is wait until they give off the gametes, the eggs and the sperm, before we can sex them. So that when they spawn, the males will give off like a smoky-like substance, that's the sperm, and we'll collect all the males into one bucket. The females will give off the eggs. You can actually see them, they're like little particles, and we'll separate the females into a separate container. After we fertilize the eggs, we check them to make sure that they're fertilized. You can see the cell division, early development phases. So we check for that, and then once we're convinced that we have a successful spawn, we'll put the fertilized eggs in the larvae culture system.
The hatchery, particularly the disease resistance program that they're working on for selecting shellfish that can withstand some of the common but very threatening shellfish parasites that are frequent along the eastern seaboard. We've had just recovered from a major episode of what we call MSX, very devastating parasite. The parasite has no human health implications. It doesn't cause disease in humans, but it can be very devastating to oyster beds, and we've had some major crop losses in the late 1990s.
This room is the hatchery room. This is where we grow the shellfish larvae and also set them and grow them to about the size of a pinhead. We add food, we keep the temperature, summertime temperature, and as the larvae grow, we screen them to separate the fast growers from the slow growers. The oysters that I screened today, some of them are ready to set. This is a setting tray. It has a mesh bottom, and the mesh size is small enough so that the shell and the oysters can't fall through, but water can come into the tray and circulate through. The shell is very tiny, so we can get 1 oyster per shell. And this is called microculture. It's actually ground up clamshell. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this in the tank. After a few days, they'll set. And you can tell they've set because you'll see these little brown patches here. Those are the oysters set on the shell, and the brown is the food in their guts. You can actually see through them. When they get a little bit bigger, we put them in this tank system, and this is called an upweller. Again, we have a screen bottom. You see the animals in here are a little bigger. We have larger ones that we use out in the field nursery. This is basically the last step before they go out into the natural water. It just reaches a point where we can't afford to feed them. Oysters eat a lot of food, and we're keeping millions of oysters in this hatchery system. They get too big to feed, we have to put them out into the natural water, but we use this same process, this upweller type process, but instead of pumping water through that we've added algae to, we're using the natural water. We're relying on the water in the Mystic River.
Did you get hit? I'll lift. Okay. An opportunity for that.
After we take them out of the upwellers, we'll bring them back to the shop and we'll run them through the cull machine that's over there, and we'll size them to anything that's over 25 millimeter we'll normally have put in the cages. Anything that stays under that size we'll put back in the upwellers and try and grow it out a little bit bigger. These are the cages that we use after they come out of the upwellers, so we'll size them to at least 25 millimeters before we put them in these cages. You all right there?
Yeah, I was running over a buoy and it wasn't really helping me.
Another knife, don't lose that.
You know what I mean?
Take that with you too.
Why, do I look like I'm going to cry or run it off the dock?
Just looked like you were unsure of yourself. All right, we'll see you guys in a little bit.
Yeah, good luck. No headache.
Foul line on there. And they'll sit out in the cages until at least October, and we put them in an estuary where it's warmer and pretty quiet water, and we'll get them up to probably 35 to 40 millimeter in the cages, and then we'll pull them out again at the end of the year, recull them and size them again, and put them in another cage with a different mesh size on it, and then they'll sit for the winter. From the time they come out of the upwellers, they're going to get culled at least 3 times and moved into 3 different size cages. It'll be at least 2.5 years from that point, after they get out of the upwellers and into the cages. It'll be at least 2.5 years. Best case scenario. And from that point on, they'll end up going out in the sound and growing to the point where they're marketable. Cages have to be handled probably at least every 2 months at a minimum. One of the big problems we also have is fouling on the cages, and if you leave the cages unattended, you're going to get to a point where there'll be so much fouling on them that you won't get any circulation through the cage, and the stuff will end up dying in there. We also have a problem with the slipper shells that attach themselves to the oysters also, and that's a big job to keep ahead of that, because once they grow to the point where they're firmly attached on the oyster, then you have a real job cleaning the oyster up so it has some degree of acceptable presentation when you finally get it to the restaurant. And they're also eating the food that the oysters want to eat too. So it's everything's competing. Biggest problem that we faced is being able to logistically do everything ourselves, and we were able to figure out how to do this, but then with all the amount of things that you need to do and the struggle to have a place to operate out of, we found that trying to work cooperatively with other growers, it makes it an awful lot easier to spread our time out and have the ability to share resources, time, and expertise. So what we've been able to do is we got this facility to work out of where none of us could possibly afford to own this property. So it's an opportunity for us to work at a common goal with shared facilities and shared labor.
Steve Plant gave up the world of the three-piece suit and Wall Street to come on board the co-op as treasurer.
A lot of the people who are involved here have all started small, because that way, when you do kill some, when you find out problems and you overcome them, you at least haven't killed everything. You haven't made this big capital investment and watched it all go down the drain. So over those 3 years, and over these guys an even longer history, have done a lot, big learning curve. Have figured out how to minimize the risk and keep things alive and grow them where we grow them and get them looking good so the market wants them and all that other stuff. And now that we have a lot of these methodologies down, the next step is, as this hatchery gets going, is to do it on a larger scale. This game is all volumetric increase. You start out with 1 million oyster larvae or clam larvae or whatever that fit in a Dixie cup. And 3 years later, those 1 million animals are a friggin' pile that would cover this pad.
It gets pretty snotty in this end of the sound when we get a west wind. basically unbearable. We come out here right off the dock here. It's nice and flat, but you get around the point, Morgan Point there, and if you got a southwest blow, I mean, we're shielded by no-ank here. You get around that point, you got the whole fetch of the sound coming up and piling up right at the end. So we have a small shoal draft little boat that we need to use to get in these tight areas, but you still have to get around the point and get to where you have to go. And you know, you're dealing with, sometimes we'll have 4 or 5 foot seas out here, and it's kind of tough to go in one of these little boats. What we got to do is put these clams out. They're polluted, so they got to go overboard for a minimum of 2 weeks.
Get cleaned up.
Yeah.
So you're going to go out in the boat and do that?
We're debating. That's the bigger boat.
Yeah, I don't know.
We might be able to do that.
I mean, just at the dock here, and it's southwest, so
Yeah, really.
they were calling northwest.
Well, go take a look off the end of the dock and look up that way. And
Yeah,
ask
you see the
yourself if
waves
you wanna
just
go.
crashing over the rocks. I mean, if I got to get these in the water regardless, so, you know, I'll probably
Double move.
I'll probably try to get them out there. And it's going to be an adventure.
For crab traps.
Colder, so it's got to be going somewhere.
We have 2 choices. We have that, if it's decent enough.
Karen explains through the wind that they have 2 choices. One is to drive over to the next cove in their truck and launch the inflatable. The other is to take the bigger boat from the dock here and go round by sea and hope that they can make it.
I mean, it's, you know, it's guerrilla, but it'll work.
Hang on a minute. Don't go anywhere. There it is.
The hole in it?
Yep.
You need a gun?
Right here. I actually, you know what?
How big of a hole?
Screw it. I'm just going to move them away from.
Yeah, I'll give you a bag.
All right. All right. Give me a bag. There we go.
Got it?
Yep.
Most of the time it's, you know, we have pretty fair weather and we're able to do what we need to do, but when it gets like that, it's probably not the wisest thing to go out in any of these boats. A lot of days we've got things planned that we want to do a certain task that day, and we try to do everything we can do, but some days the weather is just so horrendous that, you know, you got to figure out some other way of doing what you got to do. And, you know, we're dealing with, you know, small boats and lousy weather, and sometimes it just gets to the point where you got to say no and figure some other way out, you know, to use up the day.
Another advantage of the Mystic Estuary area is that there are enough nooks and crannies around the corner for Jim to find a protected lee. is fast approaching Noank. The Christmas decorations are up at Carson's, and the hatchery crew will not only have to deal with the more frequent storms, but the intense cold even on calmer days. Noank hasn't changed much in the last century, and Carson's, established in 1907, still serves home-cooked meals to locals and fishermen alike. The talk this morning is not about the cold, but the increasing regulations and state budget cuts that could have a major impact on the hatchery. Noank shell fishermen can deal with the elements. They have overcome predators and disease, but feel this is something they can't control, and the politics could threaten their very existence.
See you later.
Merry Christmas, Karen. All right, take it easy.
We're still in a startup situation, and we keep working all the time to figure out ways to save a step on everything. So, in our naive early thinking, if we had stayed at the path that we were going, we absolutely would have been doomed, because the oyster would have cost $10 a piece at the rate of, the effort that we were putting into it. So what we were trying to do initially is just grow something that we could actually say we grew, and it's worth eating or selling. So now, each year we seem to figure out better and easier ways to do things, and it's an evolution that we have to basically, never stop trying to figure out how to do things in a more civilized way. Most of the things that have been available, we've ended up trying and find that they don't work. Because most of the things that people have tried have done it on an academic level. You can make things work, but you can't make money at it. So, to make money at this, you got to really be creative in how and what you do and how you spend your time doing it. And, that's an evolution. And, there's a difference between being, paid for your time and having to pay for your time. So we're in a situation where we have to pay for our time, and our time is money in the long run, so we better figure out a way to do it efficiently.
They all look good.
Converting the 2.5 years of sweat equity into cash takes place in a variety of ways. On this day, however, it is but a 5-minute walk up the hill to the Noank Universal, a grocery store built over 100 years ago by shipyard carpenters from the village and still maintained by local boatyard workers.
Hey, Frankie. Hey, what's up, guys?
Got your oysters for you, buddy.
All right, excellent. Wow, they look good. Yeah, these look good.
Frank Quartella Jr., behind the meat counter, is the third generation of proprietors.
There you go.
Oh. Mm.
When the parasites came and cleaned everything out, I decided that in order to make it in this industry, you'd have to try everything that you could think of to make it work. Oystering is very hard work, and if you like it, it's fun. If you don't like it, it's probably the worst job in the world, but it's like every other job. If you like it, no matter what it is, it's fun, and you enjoy doing it, and this is why I do oystering. For whatever reason, I just enjoy it.
It really offers an opportunity to see the importance of preserving the sound and improving our water quality, because this is it's a food production industry. And I think it's very important to Connecticut's economy. Again, it was historically, and I think it has a bright future here, and the hatchery is going to add a lot to that.
I grew up on the water, and work always kept me away from it. Now work kind of is there.
One of the main reasons I got into shellfish aquaculture is because I am a naturalist, conservationist. I want to be able to do something that's good for the environment and feel good when I go to bed at night. And I know that what I do for a living not only It produces food, which is very satisfying, but it's also good for the environment.
There's a lot of miserable times, a lot of tough weather, but one of the things I look at is we're working in a place where people want to come to go on vacation. You know, the summer is great, the winter you're going to pay for it, but it's very satisfying to grow something from nothing and have you know, all your effort into this product that you're growing, and we put a real lot of pride into it, and it's kind of our life now. It's not a job, it's a lifestyle, and you can't look at this thing as going into it to make a lot of money. You look at it as a lifestyle, and this is how you live your life and what you like to do and where you like to be.
In spite of the storms and all the obstacles facing the shell fishermen today, the building of the Oyster Co-op in Noank is leading the way as a model for the restoration of this once great industry. It's ironic that oyster aquaculture, which started with the Romans and Chinese almost 2,000 years ago, is a technology that could save a modern industry. The old ways of oystering using boats like the Annie are almost gone, but there's hope that with improved methods and lots of hard work, the industry will come back, and with it, a way of life that has its roots in the tradition of working waters. As Marcel Proust, the great French writer of 100 years ago, put it, we dream of the taste of seawater found in an oyster, in the tiny drop of salty liquid drunk from the oyster's iridescent shell, which has truly lived in the sea. The oyster that we should like to raise to our lips and swallow. And so it comes about that you have not only the oysters for which you are longing, but the sea itself.